Now recording.
So, welcome to Saturday Afternoon Phenomenology Club Fight Club. I wanted to argue with someone because I'm in the mood, I'm feeling feisty, and our new member and friend, Filthy Casual, has proposed a hot take for us to argue. So, instead of paraphrasing it for her, you are a her, Filthy?
Uh-huh. That's true.
So, instead of paraphrasing it, I will have her rephrase or paraphrase or restate rather, sorry, the argument, and then we'll fucking throw down. Let's go. Hit me.
All right. Well, you may have to excuse me. I am going through a bit of a weird brain fog moment, but this is essentially what it boils down to. I think that our society right now is overly rationalistic, as in we need a rational explanation for everything that we see and do. And I guess the best way to put this is I think that a lot of people default to being atheists, which actually, in my opinion, decreases their quality of life because from also my experience and from what I believe, people are meant to think in terms of metaphors and archetypes, which religion is typically full of. Of course, I don't agree with, let's say, the Anglican Church doing all sorts of shit like, oh, okay, if you're a gay person, you're definitely gonna go to hell and we need to ostracize you from the rest of society. I don't believe in that, but I think that in the purest form, humans need a sort of interaction with a higher being and need to be able to think in terms of metaphors and archetypes. Oh,
Oh,
and there is a second follow-up part to that argument, which is that I think that going forward, psychedelics will play a huge role in the revival of spirituality. So, and I also don't believe that you can just, take a ton of acid and then expect to see God and everything is all peaceful and great. I think that it's extraordinarily powerful in order to break down that rational way that people tend to think. But that sort of spiritual awakening needs to be supported by, let's say, therapy or practice or self prayer and meditation, stuff like that.
okay. Well, I disagree with you, obviously, which is why a bit I'm ready to throw down. But I would ask you the first thing that makes me think with what you just said is you're saying that right now people feel this need to rationalize the external world and their experience of being in it, and that religion is something that runs counter to this. But I would say I'm not sure how you can say that religion is not a rational thought process or spirituality, because isn't it true that people who believe in God, even if we disagree that this is a rational take, they are still doing the same thing an atheist is doing? I'm an atheist. They're trying to rationalize their experience, and what seems most rational to them is there must be a God that has created everything. So I'm not sure how you can say that these two separate ideas are really of any sort of differing quality at baseline. Aren't they just different rational explanations of existence?
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Perhaps that's not quite getting to the heart of the issue, though, because I don't really like the way that a lot of theists argue that, okay, there must be one God that created man in the image of himself and then, like, created the entire universe and evolution is fake. Because, yes, exactly, I completely agree with you. I think the people that follow the Bible like a set of rules and see it as a guideline to explain everything in the world is completely missing the point. Perhaps what I'm more so saying is, the fact that we exist is incredible, and people don't really take that as how do I say this? As seriously as they perhaps should. So maybe I should give an example to illustrate what I mean by an overly rationalist way of looking at the world. So, for example, by saying, well, there's no proof of a higher power, there's no proof that there's anything beyond what we can see and touch, therefore, no sort of God could possibly exist. I think it's true. I can't prove otherwise, but I just can't shake the feeling that, if you've ever taken a relatively heroic dose of psychedelics, you will have seen the fabric of reality. And from my experience doing that just a few times, it truly revealed to me that, my consciousness does not end after death. And there is a whole sort of meta reality that exists that for some reason we are unwilling to confront.
Well, I have also taken a heroic dose of psychedelics and then some. And my experience greatly differs from yours. I mean, I definitely had a quote unquote transcendental experience. I've had many with psychedelics, but my interpretation of that event greatly differs from yours. I mean, I don't think that taking high doses of psychedelics proves anything. And I also think that no matter what I experience, my immediate translation of this experience is not something that I should put full trust in anyway. You know, you're saying that you've seen the meta fabric of reality, and that's just one interpretation. I'm sure we had pretty similar experiences, but we obviously walked away with completely different interpretations. So who's to say that either of ours would be correct?
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And perhaps this is a decent segue to another thing that I wanted to touch on, which is, yeah, perhaps this is a choice to be made in a sense, as in, you can look at the experience of taking psychedelics, which, as in your words, is transcendental, as, oh, okay, a bunch of chemicals in my brain, it just went haywire, and that's why I saw a ton of shit, and that's why I felt very different, and it's all due to drugs, and that's basically the conclusion of it all. Or you can walk away from it thinking, I see in terms of metaphors, I see the fabric of reality, and I know that there is so much more out there than what we are limited to in terms of our human perception. And my main point in making that is, I think that crossing over that boundary creates more meaning in life in a great sense, at least for many people. I can't say that this is true for you or any other person specifically, but I think as a trend, people in society, with, obviously this is just one factor. I'm not saying this is the only factor. A lot of people are facing like a meaninglessness crisis where they are suffering with depression, anxiety, loss of direction in life, and just a feeling of not knowing where to go. And I think that a contributing factor, of course, I need to reiterate, not the only factor, is a sort of, confinement to just thinking that we are the only things out there.
Well, it's interesting that you identify that as the problem because when you're talking about things like meaninglessness and Western society specifically, where it's been going and people are having a hard time feeling as if life has lost all meaning, I mean, this is a popular critique. And I feel like it centers around this idea that humans, especially in like the postmodern age, have come to realize that all meaning is constructed, right? And I feel like this is the thing that becomes depressing to a lot of people. But I mean, I think that that attitude, again, it comes down to interpretation. Like certain people feel as if all meaning is constructed, therefore I feel as if everything I've ever aspired for is hopeless and futile, because I thought I was chasing this dream and there was some answer, some light at the end of the tunnel, and now it's gone because I realize it doesn't exist and everything's fake and shit. But the way I interpret this line of thinking is that it's actually incredibly empowering to realize that as humans, we are the creators of all meaning. We create all metaphors, all religions, all schools of rational thought. Everything that we interact with in the realm of concepts is our creation. And I feel like that's a thing that you can take great pride and pleasure in. So I think that this also comes down to interpretation. And it's interesting you speak of metaphors. I think that even rational thought is also a metaphor. I don't interact with anything in my experience directly. I can never really experience an object even that I'm picking up and holding. I only experience it in this way that's ultimately filtered through my own perception of it. So I feel like on some level, the principle of metaphors is true for literally everything, even the most neutral, rational seeming concept. So I don't even know where you would draw the line, some sort of distinction between what's a metaphor and what's something more direct. I feel like everything is wrapped up in the same mechanism of action, this like obfuscation and
Mm.
removal of layers of reality from what you're experiencing.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that you look at it that way. Well, what it initially brings up in my mind is, all right, let's say you see a table in front of you, and right now you touch the table, it's brown, it's solid, it's cold, and all of that. You, your again, with the example of psychedelics, you take like a shit ton of drugs and suddenly the table no longer exists. It is the table a metaphor in that sense? Is that what you meant?
No, I don't mean that it no longer exists. I mean, when we take psychedelic drugs, obviously, I think we perceive things differently than what is normal, you know? And this is true
Mhm.
for all drugs, period. I mean, even caffeine alters your perception. You experience things differently. I do think that psychedelics are a really useful tool in that they help us open our minds and realize that our human perception is very limited. Our sober experience is just one experience out of many, you know. Maybe taking psychedelics likens our perspective experience more to like a certain animal species or something, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
But I'm
I would
not saying that the table is a metaphor. I'm saying that the very concept of table is already kind of a metaphor, period, because I'm just coming up with a word, table, and a concept to interact with this thing, the table. But I mean, what is a table outside of the concept of a table? Tables don't really exist in actuality. The concept table is a word we came up with to describe this thing that we created that typically has these kinds of features, you know. But I can never experience a table, really. I can only experience what I think a table is.
Right, fair enough. Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense, and if you look at it that way, then for sure. Perhaps what I mean more specifically in terms of metaphors and archetypes is, I mean, I'm not really a student of the Bible. I haven't really read it from front page to back cover or anything like that. But just to give an example, you have a story of like, hmm, right. So let's just take the most popular biblical story with Adam and Eve. You can take it
Mhm.
literally or you can take it metaphorically. Or to give a more modern day example, like the idea of lizard people. If you take it literally and not metaphorically and not archetypically in a sense, then obviously it sounds batshit insane. But if you just sort of abstract your mind a bit from the logic of the story and look at it from the sense of, okay, so right now, let's say we have a bunch of people in government that are so detached from the rest of the population that they may as well be seen as lizards, then suddenly things make a lot more sense. Whereas if you try and, how do I put this? If you try and, let's say, create, okay, okay, so taking a step back and maybe giving a better example. Right, so do you agree that words and trying to create a sentence of thoughts is a sort of like lower quality version of what the truth is? So let's say I have an idea or like a truth that I feel in my heart. When I try to say it out loud, that's like a compressed version of what's actually, you know, what I'm actually thinking about.
Um, I mean, I wouldn't say that truth is really an existent thing either. It's not existent in the external world. You know, I think we use the external world as the determinant of truth. Like if I'm trying to
Hmm.
communicate to you that the apple is red, you know, this apple is red, then these real life variables, or at least what I experience as real life variables in my specific human perception, a human perception that can distinguish this object, the apple, as distinctly set apart from other objects. Also, it appears to be this color red, you know, that you could maybe call a truth of how I experience the apple. It's not some
Mm.
external truth, obviously, because even other animal species won't experience the apple the way I do. I'm just trying to communicate something you could call a truth. I mean, you might as well, because humans are the creators of truth and therefore we set the standards. So I think most
Yeah.
things that are true to us are not necessarily true to other species, true in any sort of external sense. I don't believe that truth is some real actual thing, but I believe it's a useful concept. And yeah, that the ultimate thing we're trying to describe is how things quote unquote are, at least to human perception in the external world, you know? But I wouldn't say that
Okay.
there's some true statement to be made.
Alright, yeah, I mean, I actually quite respect that take, and a lot of these points I haven't completely ironed out in my head, so these are things that I'm sort of toying with and maybe half agree or mostly agree, but I'm not completely dead set in that or anything. However, you know, do you believe that there is such thing as a truth that you know personally to be true, as in maybe it's not a universal truth for all species or all humans or anything like that, but just something that you know deep within you is true.
No, honestly, I don't. I don't
Really?
feel that way. No.
Wow,
Do
okay,
you?
that well, actually, yeah, that's pretty fascinating. Like, I actually am quite curious as to what that feels like and how you operate through the world. I mean,
Well, what would be a truth that you feel you hold?
well, it would definitely vary on the situation. I mean, for instance, let's just give like the most recent political example. Like, let's say, poor George Floyd gets murdered, you know in your heart that's wrong. Like, you know that's the truth, right?
Right?
So that is something that you know, right? That isn't a truth that you can just like throw out there and say, that isn't. I mean, obviously, some people think that it's not true, but for you, you would think that that is true, and so I'm just curious as to what you
Of
would
all the
actually.
things to choose.
Oh, I just gave, like, one of the most vivid examples that I think everybody would sort of, like, have a strong take on, and so maybe that would be, a good example to illustrate how a person can feel something is true within them, even if, let's say, you don't believe in universal truths.
Right. Well, I mean, the murder of anybody, I mean, we don't have to use him specifically, but the murder of anyone, I would say, depends on a contextual basis, right? Whether or not we think that it's wrong or not. And like you're saying, I mean, this won't be universally accepted, how you feel about any individual's death. But the reason that I can say assuredly to myself that I believe any individual's death is wrong is not because I think that deaths can be wrong on some sort of actual intrinsically true level, in a different world society and a different set of circumstances, I don't know if I would think that that specific death or any specific death is wrong, but it's wrong because of all the other variables I observe around it,
Precisely. Exactly,
So,
and sorry to interject, but this is such a
mhm.
good point to jump in to illustrate why I think metaphors and stories are so important because and you may disagree with this, and I don't even 100% agree with this, but I think there is so much value in old, even biblical stories because these are thousands of years of humans as they've grown as society looking at all the contextual clues to find out like sort of truths that you could well, they won't be universal all the time, but truths that you can apply to your life and interpret in a useful way, right? So,
Well,
like, so a lot of like this is why you cannot look at biblical stories in a literal sense. You have to sort of try and get to the heart of the point. Like, I don't know how else to illustrate this example than like,
but can I
well,
ask you, would I do
go ahead.
this with another work of fiction too? Like, why would the Bible be one versus, like, I don't know, literally any other work of fiction? Let's say the Odyssey or something. Should I give one of these some sort of priority in my head? Like, is
No,
there. I don't
you
get
don't.
what you're really calling for because I think that even someone like myself, I am an atheist, and I was raised fundamentalist Christian, so I also have observed the dangers of giving people these kinds of materials and promoting them because a lot of people do believe them literally. I'm
Oh,
not sure
definitely.
of what the usefulness would be, period, because I mean ancient times people from it's not like this work had been built upon for centuries and centuries. It underwent major edits, mostly made by a few key individuals. It really doesn't represent some sort of like broad perspective of the human species or something. It might as well have been written by like five people. So why would something like the Bible be something I should look to as a useful guide for metaphors and alliterations and stuff versus what my neighbor wrote, like his fantasy fiction thing, like that. I'm sure in any piece of fictional writing you'll be able to find useful archetypes that might have their foundations in ancient times, but I guess I'm just wondering, like, what is the usefulness of this? I mean, I think I can see metaphors in the Bible, but what would you propose I do with them? Someone like myself who's an atheist.
Okay,
Like,
fair enough. Yeah, completely agree that I don't think that this sort of way of looking at metaphors is exclusive to the Bible. I definitely think that you can look at great works in history, like for example, the Odyssey, or even modern fictions, and take something greater away from it. I don't think it's exclusive at all, in fact. But the reason why I'm sort of singling out the Bible right now, at least, is because despite it being written by, a relatively small amount of people, it's created an insane impact on the world. That's just undeniable. The Western society that we know today is greatly influenced by the Bible, for better or for worse, but it's undeniable that it has been. And on top of that, the Bible, if you look at the Old Testament all the way to the New Testament, you can see how human society has evolved over time, and the formation of laws, and the sort of, for example, the Ten Commandments, or simple things such as, you shouldn't steal from your neighbor, for instance. Those are rules that humans have formed through trial and error as society was going through its gestational stages. And so, in that sense, due to the great impact that the Bible has had on our current society and the world, and because it spanned over thousands of years, I think that it has a great deal of wisdom to impart, and for even for everybody. You don't have to believe it, and I strongly, strongly, strongly cannot emphasize this enough. Disagree with people who read it literally, because I don't think that's the way that you're supposed to read it, despite that being how it's been used throughout history. I don't think that's the truth of it. Um, but I think for an atheist, or for anybody, you can read it and try to look at it through a metaphorical lens. Like, take a step back and ask yourself, what is this trying to say? Are there any stories that I have seen in my life or around the world in modern times that reflects the same truth? You know what I mean?
I do, but when you're suggesting that people do a thing like look at the Bible and think, what is it trying to say? I mean, isn't that already what people of quote unquote more rational mindsets do? Because you're suggesting that people interpret it and give it a newer interpretation, but isn't that what people try to do when they rationalize the world?
Yeah, I think so.
Because this conversation started with you suggesting, that this use of metaphors is a useful thing versus taking more rational approaches to understanding the world. But then if the key to getting anything out of a text like the Bible is found through interpretation, then I would argue that that's being rational. So I don't think that you're really promoting or saying that people need to use metaphors more or can find better meaning out of them, if what they're supposed to do with these, if the only usefulness in them is found in interpreting them and making them more rational.
Yeah, okay, you may be right. I may be semantically mistaken. I guess what I more so mean is, if we look at metaphorical text, it's like a shortcut to better rationalizing the world, if you will. As in, you can go into life and try and sort of wade your way through it by making sense of it using your own brain, or you could also have the added help of thousands of years of stories and metaphors as well, and use that in the context of your life.
But do you think it's really a shortcut? Because, I mean, let's think about this example you just raised. Don't steal from your neighbor, You can look at old ancient texts, I mean, because this is clearly a universal concept in cultures that have had nothing to do with the Bible. I mean, Asian cultures, all sorts of cultures have come to similar conclusions. It's not good to steal from your neighbor, What would be the usefulness in going through all these metaphors and stuff? It doesn't seem like a shortcut. It seems more like a waste of time, I would argue, than to just wonder into why have old cultures decided that it is not good to steal from your neighbor.
Well, maybe this is the same reason why it's useful to study history,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, okay, if we even just look at the example of stealing, and maybe we should sort of like step away from the example of the Bible, but now more move towards more of like a historical context. If we look at the example of you shouldn't steal, well, in certain contexts, maybe you should steal. Maybe you should. If you're starving to death and you're living in an oppressive regime, and like you're in fucking, I don't know, like you need to steal food in order to survive, I don't think it's wrong to steal. But so therefore, like, you need to life life is extraordinarily complex, especially now. Because we're just coming out of like a very rigid way of thinking because it's true that, God recently died. Most of the world was strictly religious and like sort of believed things in a very, how do I say this, consistent way across the board, almost because everyone believed in God and the same thing and the same set of rules. We just broke free from that, and now we're trying to sort of like rebuild and rethink our way through, and find a way forward in life as a society. And there are there's so much complexity within it that it's extremely difficult to just face it without studying history, without studying old stories, without studying how civilization came into place and how society was rebuilt across history as a whole. If you catch my drift.
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like we're only talking about the Western world right now, because, like, again, to bring up Asia, I mean, they're a largely secularist society, and even in ancient times, a lot of their spiritualities also trend towards more what you'd now call secular viewpoints, too. So, I,
Yeah,
I
well,
mean,
to
I
to
don't
be
feel as if. No, sorry, go ahead.
oh, well, that's sort of hitting on a strange spot for me because my parents did come from China. And with the rise of communism and the death of religion and art and philosophy, truly my grandparents suffered an insane amount, as in they were sent to labor camps. Poetry and religion were completely destroyed, manuscripts were burned, and yes, men and women became equal under the government, but it was for a cause that was just so confusing and destructive. And it is quite, and I'm not very Chinese. Like, I don't know that much about Chinese history or ancient, like, Eastern history or religion at all, really. But what I do know is the death of sort of, I guess, less rational ways of thinking in China ended up being extraordinarily destructive.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I think what you're talking about historically, I mean, this is a pretty explicit example, right? Like going through and burning philosophy and burning art and stuff, like I can see how that could be traumatizing to many people, and that is not a solution. I don't think that to accept what you'd call more rational thinking or more secular thinking requires that you go through and educate people and burn all their ancient texts and disavow them and stuff. I mean, I'm an atheist and I really love all world religions and spiritualities just from the perspective of thinking that they're great testaments to human creativity. And I think that there are all types of interesting metaphors and shit like that in them. So I don't think you have to outright reject any text, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or any religion or spirituality, to find some meaning in it. But I think at the same time, like, I mean, I don't think even if you wanted to, you could stop people from following on the trajectory of pursuing more rational ways of seeing the world, because this is a process that wasn't forced upon people, like the death of
Mhm.
God. You're saying this is quite a natural process, and it happens more and more the more that the natural sciences get built up. I mean, the natural sciences are ancient too, but it's only very recently that we've started having things like carbon dating and really getting a grasp on how old we are as a species. Human evolutionary theory is very recent. Neurology is like an incredibly new field of study. Like, as the
Mhm.
natural sciences build up, you're gonna have people more and more gravitate to this sort of thinking. So I think even if you wanted to stop it or encourage people to embrace metaphors more, I mean, I think that this effort would ultimately be kind of futile. People are going
Yeah.
to naturally want to see the world in more rational ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think this is something we could have stopped even if we wanted to. And this is why I think we're ready to sort of start exploring that aspect again. I think the last 50 years or so has been entirely focused on, scientific advancement, the atomic age, rockets going into space. All of that stuff is amazing, and I'm not going to discount it. I think that it's incredibly important for humans as a species to start exploring that more. And this is an idea I've been exploring as well, which is, I think it would be great if we were able to enter into the realm of the into the realm of the metaphysical and of the metaphors and all of that, and be able to collapse it back into the realm of the rational. I think that's extraordinarily important. So for example, let's say I keep returning to the example of psychedelics as it's the most salient thing in my mind that like would count as the sort of like spiritual exploration. So let's say you take regular doses of psychedelics and you go into this realm of self-discovery in a sort of childlike wonder where everything around you seems, you know, extraordinary, and you're quickly making patterns in your mind that you've never made before. And then you come back to earth and you look at the world in from your own eyes again. I think that you can still retain some of the things that you learned, and maybe you would just put this as opening your mind up, which is perfectly fine. Perhaps that's actually what I'm advocating for, a more open mind, while maintaining the ability to think rationally and scientifically.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're in Phenomenology Club because I don't know if you know anything about phenomenology. I wish that you were here for our last book reading, but
I
this
wish
is
I
kind
was
of very
too.
much what?
I wish I was too. Just found it, so.
Well, yeah, well, I uploaded the audio from our Husserl reading. Edmund Husserl is a German philosopher that starts phenomenology, or the method of phenomenology, but phenomenology is a concept that predates him. The first philosopher to really talk about phenomenology is Hegel. And I mean, this idea has been building in the Western tradition of philosophy for a while, but phenomenology literally means the study of that which appears. So it's the study of phenomena as you experience it, you know. And what Husserl believes kind of very much aligns with what you're calling for, that no matter what, the human experience is a thing that, well, it can't totally be beholden to the kind of rationality that we come up with to describe it, you know. We have sort of conflicting systems of logic, and so what he wanted to do is essentially create a science of experience itself, you know, and to not treat any experience as trivial. A thing like psychedelics, you know, you're talking about, who a lot of people, and this is an attitude that I also reject, a lot of people will take psychedelics and then say like, oh, you know, like you were saying earlier, my mind was just going haywire, it was on drugs, whatever, it doesn't mean anything, it's just because I took drugs and whatever, you know. And that's the cold hard scientific approach to understanding this thing, you know. But someone like Husserl would not trivialize this experience, and he believed that you should treat it with equal sort of weight, at least at baseline, you know, to your sober experience, and that there are things in that experience to learn and to interpret and to integrate into your overall worldview, you know. Because I mean, it's a rationalization to just say, oh, whatever I experienced there was worthless and just the effects of a hallucinating mind, and it's futile to even wonder into what was going on there, you know. That's also a rationalization that's founded on nothing. Why would you not take all experiences with the same sort of equal weight and investigate them, you know? So I think I agree with what you're saying, at least the most foundational ideas you're saying, you know, because like I said too, I mean, I think even natural science can be understood as a sort of religion or spirituality too. A lot of people, I think that it's a better one, you know, but I don't think that these things function in any implicitly different ways, you know. Saying that God created the world is still a rationalization as saying, oh, the Big Bang happened or whatever, you know.
Mhm.
These are two conclusions that follow similar processes to reach them, you know. So I don't think that there's anything starkly different between them.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I think that at the base of a lot of disagreements are people that fundamentally agree with each other.
Agreeing.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
a
And
lot
this is part of the important, I mean, this is actually the idea, I feel like, that underlies this very argument too. You know, a lot of people talk about as if like there's matters of the spirit and then there's matters of science. They talk as if there's these two existing schools of knowledge or of thinking that completely contradict each other. But like I said, I mean, I think that me and a Christian even have a lot in common with the way that we think. We both exist in this amazing world. We look around and say, oh, this and that. We draw connections between what we are similarly observing, and we just come to separate conclusions. But since we're following the same exact process, we just deviate at a certain point. I think that we can use what we observe about the kind of criteria that underlies any one of our preliminary conclusions about the world. We can see what kinds of connections we're drawing, what kind of criteria we apply to all different sorts of conclusions, and then we can see where we deviate, and also why we think somebody might have deviated in a way that we disagree with. Because I would
Mhm.
argue that the Christian, it's not that, God is real is any sort of irrational conclusion. I would just say that everything that they did up until that point, I feel like they are betraying their own general worldview to conclude that therefore God must be real. Because like we do observe things in the world similarly, come to similar conclusions. We both watch the Weather Channel. We both put faith in the idea that if I put one foot in front of the other, I'll walk. It's going to be sunny today because the TV tells me so. I believe in natural science. I use all this sort of criteria to come to these separate conclusions. I would argue that the Christian is not being irrational, but when they say that there must be a God, that they're using ration here in a way that contradicts the ways that they typically use rational thought. So I think that they're making an error in how they're executing something. Not that the statement itself is irrational necessarily. I mean, it's just kind of semantics there, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, which is, again, why I get quite annoyed when people get caught up in the semantics of religion and arguing, the historical accuracy of all these things, trying to prove their belief in God when really, they're criticizing people who are atheists and apply rationality in the exact same way. I completely agree. That is quite hypocritical and annoying, and I believe missing the point. But yeah, I'm really glad we had this discussion, and it sort of cemented this idea that I had within me, which is that, yeah, again, at the root of a lot of disagreements, whether over religion, the way we look at the world, or politics, or feminism, or any of these things, probably are people who are fundamentally quite similar and want similar things for the world.
I agree. I'm glad we had this discussion too. This was fun. Can I say one more
Yeah.
thing? Not to open
Yeah.
a can of worms.
Yeah, feel free to.
But I think that the Bible in particular is a really interesting thing, and I don't know how these criticisms will unfold as time goes on, but I think it's also, for me, something with the Bible that makes me not even want to treat it as some sort of, outright metaphor too, is also thinking about how I think the New Testament in particular really kind of serves a political agenda. I personally don't believe that Jesus Christ existed, period. I feel like he is this figure that was created partially to mobilize the Jewish peoples around rebelling against Roman occupation. There's no historical accounts of Jesus, period. I think the first historian to ever mention Jesus was one of the Roman historians working under Nero, that simply mentions Jesus as the leader of the Christians who, Nero is rallying up and executing. But I personally don't believe Jesus even existed, period. So I think these sorts of things also they can also inform what you're saying, looking to ancient texts and thinking about metaphors and all this and stuff. But I do think that we can get the most out of any of these texts by also being informed by histories and politics, and I think that ultimately that's best. A lot of people say that you're becoming more closed-minded when we do things like shut ourselves off to spiritualistic interpretations and metaphors and all this shit, but I personally think that you're being more open-minded the more possibilities you're willing to entertain. I think it's
Yeah.
closed-minded to say that, oh, I had this experience even, and this is what it was. Like, I think if you truly want to be open-minded, you should be willing to doubt literally anything, including your own experience, even the most transcendental of them.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, I do agree that, when you look at the Bible, it's also important to look at things not too literally, and the way that you can do that is by looking at history. So, yeah, if there's no proof for what's happening in the Bible, then maybe you should have a little more doubt and not take it as literally, and therefore be able to look at it in terms of metaphor. So, yeah, I don't know. Had a great time talking.
Me too, thanks.
Are
Should
you
I
guys
call
done?
you
Can I just
filthy?
make a comment?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can make this the official ending point, but yeah, we
Okay.
can keep talking. Let's go, Rachel.
No, I was just, well, I mean, because I do believe in the power of metaphor, but not in a narrative, ideological based aspect. So I just have a question. Why do you think that we need narrative? Because I know someone in, let's say, popular media who has rose to prominence recently, who feels the same way. He feels that there is uh, necessity to live by narratives, and his first book was called Maps of Meaning, and his
Oh,
second book was called,
Peterson?
huh?
Peterson?
Aren't you Canadian too, filthy casual?
Oh yeah, I am. Went to the
Rachel's
same.
also Canadian, and so is the guy you're talking about. You fucking Canadians and your metaphors.
Is he Voldemort? Like, are we not mentioning his name?
No,
No,
I'm
you
just
can
talking.
say his name.
Yeah, I'm just,
He who
yeah.
must not be named. Didn't he die or something?
No,
Almost.
but he was extremely
Is he
sick.
okay now?
I
I don't
think
know.
so.
Damn. He probably stepped out of
Um,
the public if he had health problems, because I imagine that was stressful.
well,
Being so hated. Can't even say his name in Phenomenology Club.
yeah, hated rolling around in all that money.
Wait,
Anyway,
so
so
was your question for Filthy?
why do you feel that, because in since the 90s, and Buttress talked, or she brought it up briefly, the development of cognitive sciences and neuroscience, and they made some recent discoveries, some, well, 90 in the 90s, about the existence of these neurons called mirror neurons, and how they're essentially they claim that they're the basis for empathy, and empathy, they claim, is the basis for reasoning. Um, so if we can, so why do you feel that we need to have some sort of, or maybe I misheard, but do you feel that a narrative, an ideological narrative, is um, is necessary?
Mm, I don't feel as strongly as Peterson in the sense that, we need this or else we're gonna face a catastrophe, for instance. But what I do see is, yeah, okay, so mirror neurons, from what I understand, is like if you see somebody make an expression. Okay, I'm just gonna bring up a study that I remember pretty quickly. So if you as an individual see somebody make an angry expression, you sort of mirror it yourself, and that allows you to be able to more strongly empathize with their emotions. However, they did this experiment where they had people who were injected with Botox in their face look at
Right.
these expressions, and they were unable to mirror it as much, and therefore were had well, I forgot how they measured it, but essentially what they found was they were slightly less able to empathize with other people. I'm not really sure how this has to relate with narratives and the way that we operate in the world. So maybe could you clarify a bit on
I
that?
mean, so I mean, yeah, that's one type of empathy, but I mean, there are there are multiple forms of, and there's, cognitive empathy and emotional empathy are, I think, two different things. And so I mean, based on actions, whether or not, I mean, there's also been a study I remember where they somewhere in, some deserted, well, not deserted island, but their tribe that has had not been had any contact with a developed, or the West, like a
Actually,
Western
and their
civilization.
expressions,
Sorry.
like universal expressions that all humans make, like anger, disgust, happiness, surprise, and
Well,
fear.
and they couldn't. They didn't. Apparently, they didn't know. Like
Right.
they couldn't.
So,
Yeah.
oh, I'm getting slightly excited because perhaps this actually relates more to why I think that stories are so important. Um, in a lot of tribal societies, again, I'm not going to even pretend like I'm an expert in any of these sort of fields, but
Well,
I
neither
do
am I.
know
Yeah.
that they oftentimes, have strongly metaphorical stories,
Hmm.
and this allows them to sort of reveal some. How do I put this? Yeah.
I know, like, I know it, like, I do see the importance of narrative, but I mean,
Mhm.
like, I don't necessarily. My question was more towards like in. I don't know if you were just necessarily talking about Christianity. I missed the beginning of the conversation, but just in terms of like an ideological narrative.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
what? Like
no.
I'm looking at this book called "Metaphors We Live By," and it's by a neuroscientist, and it's not necessarily about. Uh, it's actually not really about anything to do with narratives or storytelling and what we can learn from that. It's more about how the brain functions, in early childhood development.
Mm, okay, fair enough. I'd be interested in reading that book, but no, I don't think that we should be following metaphors in an ideological way at all. In fact, that might be one of the things that I'm the most against, because in my opinion, ideology implies that it's a set of rules that you sort of extract and feel are universal truths that should be applied to humanity as a whole. Like, is that correct?
Yeah, that sure.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
disagree with that because, you know, I do believe that there's a sort of flexibility and a sort of like gradient or gray area that humans exist in. And I don't think that what applies and rings true for one person in one cultural context will ring true for everybody. I think that perhaps
Well,
some
right.
of these stories would be more universal than others and hold, a greater amount of wisdom. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't isolate the Christian Bible as like, the universal text that holds the truth to make everybody happy in life. That's not what I mean. The reason why I think that the Bible is important is because it covers thousands of years of history and created an insanely great impact on the world that we live in. So I just think that it's worth studying.
You're right. And then how? So I because forgive me for having to ask the question if it's been repeated, but and how this relates to psychedelics. And
Hmm.
were you sort of saying that?
Yes.
Sorry, yeah.
Yes. So psychedelics, in my opinion, are important because a lot of people are unwilling to even accept any sort of metaphor into their mind, as in, I mean, I definitely grew up with a lot of people like this. I don't think this is what you guys are like. I'm not sure. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people are entirely unable or refuse to think of anything except in terms of science. And how do I put this? Like, okay,
Data,
yeah, they
quantifiable data.
yeah, they think of everything in terms of quantifiable data, and if it's not backed by some sort of thing that you can see, touch, and feel and measure, then it can't be true, and they don't give it any sort of validity, and they just find it sort of pointless, and they kind of find themselves in a place of nihilism and meaninglessness. So I think that when people take psychedelics, you can't help but sort of lose your ego, especially if you take a high enough dose. Like who you are as an individual and everything that you find important and think is true sort of ceases to exist, and it's like a kick in the balls in a sense to like sort of wake you up to a different way of thinking. And that's why I think that that is an important tool in order to, I guess a way of putting this is, help open people's minds up so that they are more able to accept metaphors, but at the same time, continue with an appropriate amount of rationality.
But okay, right. So I mean,
But I wanted to interject real
right.
quick.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I
Go
think
ahead.
I think actually, Rachel, that you said this recently, that science itself, or maybe we were talking about advertising or something, but I was thinking of this, that you said that science itself kind of is a narrative in and of itself. I mean, every concept that we've ever created is narrative in a sense, even the most simple sentence fits within this pre-existing narratives of logical thought and rationality. And to think about something like psychedelics, like what you just said, Filthy, that certain people take psychedelics and it helps them open their mind and experience the thing that some people call ego death and stuff, and that this can be useful. This can be useful, but I think it must be also through this lens of rational thinking, because other people take psychedelics too, and think, oh my god, the aliens chose me, and I have a bird head, and like I am chosen to be the next messiah, you know? So, and both of these things are pre-existing narratives. I think that there's no reason to necessarily gravitate to one or the other at first presentation, you know? How do we navigate between I have a bird head and I'm the chosen messiah, or psychedelics are a useful tool in helping me understand that human perception is very limited, and you know, trying my best to bend it might help me open my mind and think about the world in better ways, you know.
Mm,
So all of these things too are still beholden to pre-existing narratives. I feel like the only way we really have to navigating any of these processes is by examining the processes that lead us to any rational conclusion period, or any conclusion period, you know.
yeah, fair enough. I
I
think
feel like it's all found in the process, you know, like what do I choose to internalize as a useful idea, and what
isn't
do
that
I neglect?
isn't that why therapy and psychoanalysis is important? Or I mean, that's just an example of a way that you can examine processes, but like introspection is a form of doing that and trying to figure out and make sense of what you just saw is I mean, I have to recommend the usage of psychedelics with a huge asterisk, which is to say you must approach with caution because a lot of people are not ready for what they see, and therefore they start thinking that, you know, like, they have a giant bird head and they're the messiah or whatever. Yeah, and that does happen, which is why I'm not just gonna say,
It
like,
happens
every
too
18-year-old.
often.
Yeah, you know, not everybody's ready for that, and this is why I think that psychedelics needs to be paired with a lot more than just taking drugs.
Right.
Yeah. That being said, though, I do have to go and grocery shop soon, so
Okay, go do that. Thank you for this conversation. It was great. I think I'll upload it because it went really well.
aw, well, I'm honored and would love to talk again sometime or tomorrow,
Oh
I guess.
yeah. Hell yeah. We're in the chat every day and we voice chat pretty often. So pop in whenever with your hot takes. Be safe
Alrighty.
grocery shopping. We'll talk to
You'll
you
be safe.
later.
Well, thank you. See ya.
All right. Bye.
Are you leaving?
I can stay for a little bit, but
Well, I
probably
just
not too
wanted to.
much
Well,
longer.
yeah, I just because I wanted to ask too. Why? So if she's saying that, I mean, there needs to be some sort of narrative-based system. A, how do you establish a universal one? Because hasn't that been attempted for the past whatever 2,500 years? Uh, uh, and how is still using this faith, this belief system based on faith? How is that any like? Do you think that's useful?
Well, I don't want to speak for her because she's
Right.
gone, you know, but
Well, yeah, no,
I
yeah,
believe
yeah,
she wasn't saying, I don't believe she was saying that we need narratives. I think her criticism, or what she came in with, was just a criticism of this idea that a lot of people are so ready to disavow any sort of ancient texts or
okay, right,
spiritual or religious writings, and she believes that you can find usefulness in them, and also in metaphors, period, kind of, you know, which is an idea I align with on
yeah,
some level. I mean, I'm sort of skeptical. I'm not sure that it's the best way to interface with concepts, but I feel like we're generally in agreement. So, yeah. But
yeah,
what was your
okay.
question?
Well, no, because like I don't my from what I interpreted was it was related to using faith as your system to reason, which is, well, I mean, it's kind of there's a kind of an oxymoron, but like this whole thing that with that's being developed in cognitive science is pretty interesting in terms of how it talks about cognitive empathy and how we put our understand ourselves in our perceived world. And I just don't think that you need narrative. I mean, there are every episode of Friends has a narrative. and there's conflict, and then there's resolution. You know, I think you need. She was talking about how you know people need quantifiable data, and that's why they don't believe faith. I don't. I think it's the exact opposite. I mean, I think people don't like data, and I think there are studies that have shown that. You know, I haven't necessarily read them, but I do know they exist. That have shown why. You know, the example of why uh, conservatives, you know, are so hard. You know, why they essentially don't like Trump supporters. Why they believe Trump, and even though there are facts, you know, proving his statements wrong, and why his supporters still believe them. You know, that's like I would argue that that's faith, uh, because there's really
Well,
no reason why they should.
I mean, I personally think that faith is a problematic concept, period, because
Right? Yeah.
I don't believe anybody believes anything for any other reason than that they feel it is correct, you know.
Right. Right.
Christians like to say that they have faith in God, and they basically, what they mean by this is that they know that there's no proof of a God, but they choose to believe one anyway. But I
Right.
think that this is a really problematic concept because they're not choosing to believe. They just do believe. This is their rational conclusion, you know. I can't choose to believe anything. Like,
Yeah.
if you tell me,
Right.
I
I see what you're
can't
saying. Yeah.
choose to believe that there's a God because I don't believe there's a God. And Christians cannot choose to believe that there is not a God, you know. So I don't
Yeah.
believe that you can choose anything, period. And to talk about things like, you know, Trump supporters and stuff, why do they put faith in him? Because they believe that whatever he's spinning for them is true. You know, this isn't a choice. This is what they've rationally concluded. And I
Yeah.
think that to compare things like the natural sciences and issues of quantifiable data with more qualitative things, like even science has so much prejudicial bias interwoven into it, you know, like
Right.
as far as, you know, even a thing like the idea that there are objects external to myself. This is something that cannot be proven, you know, but this
Right. Right.
concept is integral to the natural sciences. And I think as time goes on, I mean, the biggest advancements we see in natural science are found when we change the underlying philosophy of how to conduct science, you know, because science really is just a tool and a method more than some canon of quantifiable data, you know.
Right.
It
Yeah.
changes all the time. I mean, things like the theory of repeatability wasn't even integrated into Western science until like the 17th century, which is crazy when you think about it. And science became completely transformed just because they integrated this idea that, okay, for a thing to be scientifically valid, we should be able to repeat it over and over again. Otherwise, you know, it might have just been a coincidence that this study showed this thing. If I can't repeat the same process and have the same conclusions, then I will not accept this as a scientific fact, you know. Like these are the kinds of ideas that are still always being challenged within science and changing, you know.
Yeah.
And this represents a narrative too, you know. We might come to decide in the future that actually, you know, there are certain studies, if they can be done one time, even if we can't repeat them, there is still some sort of
Yeah.
valid something to integrate into our theory of science, you know, like, so science too is still working within grand narratives, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that people are wise to doubt science too, but I think that it's silly people who just completely outright reject science. I think that this doesn't even make sense because the basic idea of science, the way to do science is just to be making observations and testing them, you know. All knowledge comes to us in this way. All knowledge is empirical, and even the belief that there is a God is empirical. You're basing
Right.
that on your first person observations. So
Right. Right. Right.
I think it's good to be skeptical of the narratives of science too, you know, but I think that most people, or what we call well-reasoned people, gravitate to science more because science is already kind of mimicking the natural mode of things, you know. I put trust because I can't choose not to in what I observe around me, you know. Even though I can say maybe none of this is real, maybe there's nothing except for myself, I can't help but feel as if I do exist and I exist in a world, and all people are in this system. Like nobody feels as if they aren't, or maybe somebody with some sort of crazy neurological disorder. But I would say the overwhelming majority of people don't feel like they don't exist and trust nothing in their experience,
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, so if that's the case, like, so then why do you think? So what? How important do you think is group identity to people and validation? Like in
Well,
terms of how. So if the proposition is that in order to achieve world peace, we need to live by metaphor and narrative. Um, like how much of that relies on group identity and being validated by what's there's a Freudian term for why power numbers, I can't remember it.
fuck Freud.
No, well, I know, like, that's why I'm so like, so
But wait, I don't even get the question. You said if world peace was, what's that about? If world, we can
well,
have
no, because I mean, it just says like a blanket just a generalization of what the discussion was about, is you
She wasn't implying that though.
well, right, but I mean, she was talking about getting everyone more or less on the same page, right? And
Well, I think she was saying that I think she was saying that, because all different sorts of cultures create narratives and stories and religions that really kind of resemble each other, that this is useful to look at and see what's similar among them, because perhaps there are some universal properties of human experience, which undoubtedly there are,
language is one,
Well, yeah. But yeah, and language itself almost represents some sort of religion. I mean, look at how, if you look at different languages and see which languages created similar words for similar phenomena, I think that that's definitely revealing too,
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, good
Fuck
chat. Yeah, fuck him. He fucking sucks.
But it's interesting because that's what he talks about in his first book.
I never read it.
No, I mean, I just know the gist of it, and
well, part of the problem, he's an example, I think, of how looking to archetypes as some sort of proof of something can become quite problematic, because just because it may be true that all human societies gravitate to certain sort of archetypes. They treat women and men similarly, or they treat the differences between them similarly. They do this or that. That's not proof that this speaks to some underlying truth that we should all be venerating or is inevitable or anything like this. And I think his opinion specifically on like women, this is how I learned about him because of all the bullshit he was speaking. I think that he represents like the dangers of this kind of thinking, that archetypes reveal some sort of fundamental truths of human experience, and so it's ultimately futile to fight against them or something. I mean, he's always railing against feminism and women who want to work and don't want to be domestic caretakers and nurturers and mothers, and this is an ancient archetype that's observable in every human civilization, things like this. Like it really is, it's confining. You're putting limitations on yourself for no reason, just because humans did this for so long. And also, I mean, we were talking about this the other day, like civilization is not nearly as old as we are. We are still, assuming we survive long enough, we're still in the first incarnation of human civilization. Who knows how long that we'll be here. So like we're going to be ancient history one day, assuming, of course, we survive, which I'm sure that we will, because even if 99% of humans die tomorrow, there's still 700 million left of us, you know?
Right,
Like,
yeah.
I don't think we're going anywhere for a very long time, and I think that one day we will be ancient history. And so it's like, why would the age of metaphors or something, that alone, because that seems to be the ultimate defense for like why the universality across human civilizations, and also the age of these myths and legends, these are the things that were like, there must be something, there's got to be something there. It's like, well, why, you know? We're going
Yeah.
to be ancient history one day too, and we have a lot of other ideas that contradict a lot of ancient ideas, so it's like, it's bullshit.
Right. We're all just humans.
Yeah, bruh.
Uh,
Chill. All right.
yeah.
Well, I'm gonna pick out the robot. Good discussion. I think I'll upload it.
All right.
That was fun.
Bye.
Bye.